Nietzsche has a wonderful, and I think absolutely correct statement where he says to translate is to conquer. It was to the Romans. To the Romans, to translate was to conquer. I mean, the word translatio literally means a bringing across, right? So, I mean, let's think about the Roman triumph for a moment. One of the things that the Romans did in their triumphs was they brought back people, they brought back even trees from the lands that they conquered, and they paraded them through the streets of Rome. This is now ours, right? And so there is that sense of ownership, right, I think, in that act of absorbing Greek culture, translating Greek culture into Rome. I think the Romans give us this framework for thinking about translation, which I've been thinking about a lot, that you have the faithful translator who's like very subservient and servile and obsequious and doing the word for word thing. But then you have the free poet who's adapting and putting his own stamp on and, you know, contaminating in the case of those plays, right? You take a bit from this play, you take a bit from that play, you put it together, it's contaminatio. And that's all an exercise of independence, right?
Solomon and Smith.
Hello, I am Milo. That is Jack. We are Solomon and Smith. Neither one of us are Solomon or Smith, but we are indeed Solomon and Smith. Welcome to the channel. Today we'll be talking to Stephanie McCarter about her new-ish translation of the Metamorphoses. It's the current run Penguin. So you walk into a bookshop, it's fairly likely it's the one you'll see. This translation has a few remarkable features. One of them is that it's fairly bold in its translation of sexual violence. The Metamorphoses is in some respects a large catalogue of rapes against several gods or godlike people by gods or godlike people, and McCarter chose to translate it thusly as rapes, not as ravishments, not as amorous affairs. This changes the texture of the book somewhat, and also seems to agree with her general tone. She doesn't go for the flowery flourishes of Victorian translators or some translations you might be more familiar with, like Mandelbaum's. Instead, she has a very direct, poetic style in iambic pentameter, which renders, she would argue, closer to Ovid's than necessarily the English tradition of epic poetry. Now we can briefly talk about what the Metamorphoses is. It's an epic poem by Ovid, one of the great Augustan poets in Latin, and it looks a little like the entire history of Greek mythology, with a bit of Rome stuck on the end, smushed into one sort of continuous transforming tale based on the theme of metamorphosis, on one thing, typically a being, a god, a person, transforming into often an object. So you may know the story of Daphne and Apollo, in which Daphne, fleeing from Apollo's desire, transforms into a kind of tree. And then this is the mode of the poem. So you have one transformation followed by another and another and another, as the poem itself seems to transform. But as we talk to Stephanie, we find it isn't so much the entire scope of Greek mythology, so much as a lot of what of Greek mythology has come down to us is in fact Ovidized. His is such a popular take that when we think of some of these stories, such as Daphne and Apollo, we think naturally to his version rather than the version.
In transformation, you always become something that you always slightly were already. Arachne, who's good at weaving, becomes a spider. Narcissus, who droops over looking into his reflection, becomes the drooping daffodil. Interesting, at the start, he doesn't say bodies transformed into other shapes, but shapes transformed into other bodies. Ovid's cosmos is this strange amorphous thing. Everything is kind of one thing, and this one thing is constantly changing. We have a bit of a discussion with Stephanie about the philosophical implications of Ovid's play and play. What am I talking about? Poem! And some of the contemporary philosophers he may have been drawing on. Lucretius is the obvious.
Yeah, the word flux is thrown around a little bit in the interview, quite appropriately. Ovid pens this idea to Pythagoras, which is incorrect, but we can forgive him for that. Another element of the poem we talk about is its sort of social or political ideas. Ovid is sometimes put down as one of the other stooges of the Augustan Empire, like Virgil, someone who's literally deifying Caesar and his son. This is potentially subverted in the poem, especially in Stephanie McCarter's read of it, that potentially what Ovid is doing is writing a poem that does not give you the entire history of the universe culminating with the Roman Empire, but in fact creates a sort of method of existence that guarantees the fall of Rome. He is writing the end of Rome insofar as everything changes and nothing lasts forever. And he includes himself in that sort of algorithm, albeit he gets a fairly honorable end, which we'll talk about a little later in the interview.
It's a great translation if you're the chief virtue you're interested in is kind of concision and precision and careful word choice. It's hundreds of lines less than most other translations out there. It's about half the length of some of them, which is itself closer to Ovid's. I gather you can be more compressed in Latin than is possible in English, but there are a few sort of Americanisms in there. But
howdy, partner, said Daphne to Apollo. And we talk about this a lot, sort of style of the Latin poets and how you translate it and how you can tell, for instance, the difference between Catullus and Ovid and Virgil. When you read through so many translations, so many English voices, you sometimes lose what really distinguishes their poetic styles because you read so many different poetic styles in getting to them. So McCarter's to Mandelbaum's, those are two completely different styles, supposedly representing one single poet.
Style, yeah. Was this your first time reading the whole of the Metamorphoses?
No, I'm previously familiar, like yourself, with the Rayburn edition, which
the
was
old
the previous
Penguin.
Yeah. I stick to my Penguins.
Yeah.
It's been such a long time, and it's when I reread a sort of classic in translation 10, 15 years later, the original doesn't so much exist as a series of lines, but it is just the work. Every time I think to anything that happens in the Metamorphoses, it's just, oh, well, yeah, I read that was in that version. So there is a slightly disconcerting effect of overwriting that now this is the version of the Metamorphoses in my head. If I don't do a sort of close read of the two. So I can't exactly comment on precisely how different Rayburn was. Perhaps you have a stronger kind of living memory of Rayburn to make the contrast.
Well, I did look at quite a few side-by-side things while...
That is cheating. That is cheating.
While preparing for this, I looked through the Mirror story, because Mirror has this interesting monologue where she looks at all the other animals who can have sex with their fathers and goes, alas, I am human, where it is not allowed. I was just really interested in the kind of shocking frankness with which the McCarter version goes through the section, and did find in previous ones it was a little bit slightly more smothered. It's like the same thing is being expressed, but sometimes when something is expressed in Latinate vocabulary, some of the punch
you lose
of
just
it. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave comments about what do you think of Ovid? What do you think of Latin poetry in general? Do you prefer translations that are a bit flowerier? Do you prefer translations that are a bit more staid?
Do you like the staid translations?
Staid?
If you were to be metamorphized by a god, what would you turn into?
Yeah, that's a better one. Yeah, if you were metamorphosed by a god, what are you turning into? Please, we really want to know that. like write that below. Without any further ado, enjoy the chat. This is the best Australia could give you. This little room.
Well, it is my funny little home office, which my son takes over from me a lot. So if this were during the day, I would be on my lovely veranda. But it is in the evening and it's cool and rainy. So this is.
Do you have an ocean view?
Alas, no. We're in Brisbane, but we're about probably like a 20-minute drive from the ocean.
I see.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Australian geography. Who knows anything about that? Are you from Tennessee, Stephanie? Did I read that correctly?
I am. Yeah.
Did you ever have like a fun Dolly Parton voice that has since died down a bit?
Not only did I have a Dolly Parton voice, when I was in 4th grade, we had to do a project called Tennessee Heroes Day, and we could come dressed as anyone. And I marched into school complete with like balloons in my shirt to be Dolly Parton, and with my hair big and all kinds of makeup on. So, I was fully Dolly.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's something quite Roman about certain Dolly Parton lyrics. I was thinking, like the description of Jolene, almost like what is it? Your hair is. I can't remember Your beauty is beyond compare, with flaming locks of auburn hair, with ivory skin and eyes of emerald green. Your smile is like a breath of spring. Your voice as soft as summer rain, and I cannot compete with you, Jolene. Or even just in 9 to 5, a cup of ambition.
Yeah, so wonderful. But the Jolene, I mean, it's like the perfect blazon, right? Where you break your beloved down into kind of body parts, but of course there she's breaking the woman down into body parts, which is kind of interesting because it's her rival. She's seeing her in that way,
Yeah. And it's sort of unprecedented, like either in songs or I don't really know any poems that are from the Jolene point of view. It's just interesting. It's the woman going to the woman who could have an affair, not yet, but
right. Yeah. It's a brilliant song.
Who are some other Tennessee heroes? People came in. I'm on the list here. Al Gore. It would be funny to come to school as Al Gore.
That's true. I mean, I can't even remember who else. I mean, really, who are you going to go with besides Dolly? I will say that the one political thing Tennessee makes me proud of is that we were the state that voted to give women, like the last state needed to give women the vote to approve that amendment. So, like, that's one contribution the state made. But I love Tennessee, but I need to get out of it quite often. So
sure, yeah. Right, we start the chats with a poetic epigraph. So this is a little something I wrote. Everything transforms into itself. The apple into the apple tree, tears into the sea, the forest into the library shelf. O wage slave warehouse employee, unweave this cheap synthetic verse. The end goal of the universe is to become the universe. The beginning, the middle, and the end of time are distinct, identical crimes, or, if you like, events, the first and final syllables of two diametrically opposed sentiments, spooled and spun through precisely the same filaments. Two words in precisely the same order. I take a train to the French border and walk among the wreckage of castles. The moat is full of ducks. All is stasis, they quack. Nothing is flux. They were built as ruins. There were no battles. We are our own parents and our own issue. The metamorphosis is never from one star into a brighter, but from one thing into the same thing. A turnip, a donkey, a lamb's ear, spinach, sunshine. The year 12 AD, yeast, crocuses, spiderwebs between cypresses, green spices, honey, and crimson clover. Once everything is over, it will be there. I thought it would be nice to start with the English language, because I know from other interviews with you that it was your first love. Stephanie, I'm curious, like, who were the poets that you most loved in middle school when you started really getting into poetry?
Well, I had an obsession, I think, with Emily Dickinson. I mean, she was the poet who, I mean, just even like aesthetically, the way her poems looked on the page. I remember being in middle school, and just the way they sounded. I mean, title divine is mine. I remember saying that line over and over, the wife without the sign, something like that. But yeah, I mean, I loved Emily Dickinson. I didn't understand her poems, but I just loved the way they looked. I loved the way they sounded. And of course, she was fascinating as a person. I remember doing projects about her. Other poets I really loved back then. I mean, I had this book called like An Anthology of American Poetry or something like that. And I remember just reading the poems in it over and over and over again. I was a Byron fangirl for quite a long time as well. I think, I always was drawn to sort of more formal poetry. When I went away, I didn't go away, I stayed in Knoxville where I grew up for university. And I was going to become a high school English teacher. That was my main ambition. I had this high school English teacher.
Mrs. McKinley.
Yes. And she was wonderful. And I wanted to be like her. And then so I was going to just major in English and do that. And when I was in my major, I was drawn to medieval poetry, so I really liked Chaucer a lot.
Interesting.
But even more so to modernist poets. So I loved T.S. Eliot, Stevie Smith, loved Larkin, still love Philip Larkin. I just think he's wonderful. Modernist poets tend to be now what I'm kind of interested in and like to read a lot. So lots of sort of mid-20th century poets.
And your first Latin love was Horace, I remember you saying. Could you talk a bit about the process of first actually really enjoying a Latin poem aesthetically? Because it's different to understand your first Latin poem and then to first read a Latin poem and be like, the poetry thing is happening, the magic thing is happening.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, I think the first time I sort of saw the poem on the page, like I always think a lot about just like the visual impact of a poem the first time you look at it. And I remember just looking kind of in awe at a Horatian ode. It had just this beautiful stanzaic structure. And when I started reading, like actually getting into it and understanding it as a poem and not just as a translation exercise, I realized how much that structure was doing to communicate the meaning of the poem. So one of my favorite examples of this is, I think it's Odes 3:1, one of the Roman odes. And there's this wonderful enjambment from one stanza to another. And it's this man who's building out into the sea, and he's building over the land, and he thinks that he's the Dominus Terrae, the Lord of the land. But then when you get to the enjambment in the second stanza, it has the word contemptuous. So you have to rewrite the syntax completely so that you see he's the Lord who is contemptuous of the land instead of being the Lord of the land. And you can't do that in English. And I just remember being blown away by the fact that Latin could almost rewrite itself in front of your eyes as you progress down the page, and what you thought it was saying turns out to be not what it was saying. And English can't really do that quite as well because we're so beholden to word order. And so to me, really seeing that that almost mosaic take shape was something that was to me quite phenomenal. And then I also realized as I was reading Horace that it was where so many of those sentiments that I loved in English poetry came from, right? When you're reading the Carpe Diem ode, then you realize that sort of launched that whole Carpe Diem theme in literature. And of course, Horace wasn't making that up either. He was the heir to a whole tradition himself. So I think that's another thing I really loved about reading Horace and then realizing he was the heir to a tradition and also launched a tradition, is that poetry puts us in the long conversation of what it means to be human and to experience beauty and to think about ethics and philosophy. We do all of that in poetry, so it's the thing I think that really binds us together over time and over place, across language. Yeah.
Yeah. And he has quite a reputation for being infamously untranslatable, Horace. And there is a sort of he's one of these poets where when you look in the forums, best Horace translation, often there's quite a few people going, you don't even bother. You just got it. The only way is to learn Latin.
Exactly. Yeah. I think it was maybe, who was it? Maybe Ezra Pound who said something like, Horace remains untranslated, right? Despite the fact that all of these people have translated him. And, he was the first
Your first thing you
poet
did,
that I
yeah.
did. And it really happened just accidentally in a way. I didn't sit down one day and think I will become a translator of Latin poetry. Not at all. I had just finished my monograph on the epistles, and I was kind of flailing a bit, not knowing what exactly I wanted to do next. I had 2 young kids, and I needed something that would just be purely enjoyable. And I told myself, I remember sitting in my office one day thinking, I never want to write another word that I don't just want to write. And because I'm at a liberal arts college, I think I have a lot of freedom and flexibility in what I can do, what will count towards tenure and promotion. So I just sat down that day and started translating the Cleopatra Ode, and it was horrible. It was in prose. It wasn't... I just sort of sat down, what can I do? And over the course of the summer, it turned into stanzas, and then it turned into meter, and it just metamorphosed. And by the end of the summer, I had a whole book proposal ready to go, and everything kind of has fallen into place after that.
Yeah. I wonder if it's even possible to people who don't read Latin to summarize the different feeling that you get reading Ovid, the kind of style that Ovid has, compared to another one of his sort of pseudo-contemporary poets like Horace or Virgil. Is there something about Ovid's specific style that's unique to him? What is the experience like of reading Ovid in Latin?
Well, I would say a big difference between reading, say, Horace and Ovid is that Horace is almost like a little self-contained unit, and you're moving back and forth between the beginning and the end, and then back, and you're considering as a whole. When you read Ovid, you're kind of galloping down the page, and he's so swift, and he's moving you along. This is something that really does set Ovid apart stylistically from, say, Virgil or Horace's hexameter poetry, the satires and epistles, is that Ovid is really dactylic. So dactyls, they are they go really fast. And Latin it's not really a dactylic language. It's got lots of long vowel sounds. It wants to be spondies. It wants to be dum, 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 dum. It wants to go slow. Ovid really works against that. So he moves you along very, very quickly. And, compared to, say, Virgil or Lucretius, he doesn't use archaisms at all. There are very few archaisms in Ovid. So he feels fast and swift and modern and extremely rhetorical. Ovid's just having fun. That's the thing. You get the sense at every moment that he's just having a ball writing. And he even, in one of the Tristia poems, which is his autobiography, he says, I tried not to write poetry, but everything I wrote turned into poetry. You really get this sense with Ovid that he is a poet, and that's what he is. That's it. And so that playfulness really comes across as well. I think I was thinking about this earlier today. If you handed most classicists, a sheet of paper that had an Ovid poem on it, and you asked, who is this author? I think most people who had much familiarity with Latin poetry at all would be able to identify it immediately. Because it's very distinct in that way.
And the distinctness comes through sort of this tone. this playful tone, or is there also something in like the language, the specific word choice, those sorts of things, or is it more just like you imagine a specific kind of face when you're reading it? It's attached to a certain personality.
No, there are definitely favorite stylistic things that Ovid does. Do you want me to go through some of the more specific favorites of Ovid?
A handful
style?
would be good. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wrote down some of this as I was thinking through. Okay. I would like to say one thing that I think is really distinctive about Ovid. And he gets called playful and humorous a lot, but I want to give you a specific example of this. Okay. He's also extremely learned. Ovid clearly knows the entire epic literary tradition backward and forward. So this to me is like a classic Ovid thing. There's this famous line in Virgil's Aeneid, Book 1. And Aeneas is talking, and he and his men have just washed up on the shore of Carthage. They're shipwrecked, they've lost their homeland, they're mortified, they can barely go forward. And Aeneas says to them, I think shockingly, one day it might bring you pleasure to remember even these things, right? And it's an extremely famous line. Ovid alludes to this line. And the Latin line has the words meminisse juvabit. It will be a pleasure to remember. And there's this scene in the Metamorphoses, Book 9, where a woman cries out, ut meminisse juvat. And so it's a clear allusion to that earlier line. And she says, how it is pleasing to remember. But the context for this scene is Byblis, and she's just had a sex dream about her brother. And so it's wild that she would be quoting the Aeneid in this moment, right? And anybody would know. And so here you see, this is the essence of Ovid. He alludes to Virgil. He shows you how learned he is. He completely recontextualizes it into a moment of humor and levity, and maybe even parody, but it's hard to know exactly is this parody or not, right? So that to me is like the perfect Ovidian thing that he does.
And is this fairly consistent throughout Ovid? Like it's there from the beginning. Do you see that if maybe there isn't, but do you see a sort of progression in his kind of style towards the Metamorphoses? Or is it kind of consistently, it's this guy, he arrived fully formed?
Yeah. Well, it's kind of both. The Metamorphoses it's kind of the odd man out in terms of his poetic career, because he was primarily an elegist, and everything he wrote prior to that and everything he wrote after it was in elegiac couplets. Some people say that he writes epic poetry as if it's elegiac couplets. You can almost see the elegiac couplets are very self-contained in Ovid, as opposed to, say, like Catullus, who's got one poem of like 20-something lines that's just one sentence and it's all in elegiac couplets. But for Ovid, they're very self-contained. And you kind of see that in his hexameters as well. They're almost kind of like each line is kind of self-contained quite often. But I think there are some major differences with the Metamorphoses in terms of, this is an epic, but the seeds of Ovidianism, they were always there. His earliest work is the Heroides, right? Which is really an atypical work for him, because it's a series of epistolary poems written by mythological women to the heroes who have jilted them. So, for example, you have Dido, who writes a letter to Aeneas. But you can see there, you have to have read the Aeneid to get it. You have a female speaker who is heavily influenced by rhetoric, because this is part of the rhetorical training of Romans, that you argued mythological cases. She is responding to Virgilian values, which arguing about Aeneas's famous pietas, his sense of duty. She's putting the story from her own perspective. And this is Ovid. This is what he does, right? He's taking the whole literary tradition And in the Metamorphoses, he's often doing a lot of what he's doing in the Heroides. He's recentering the stories around women. He's showing their perspectives. He's turning epic values on their head. So he's questioning again what pietas is. So while the Metamorphoses is very different, I think a lot of the elements we see there were there from the beginning and stay there throughout his poetry. So this constant, I don't think he ever is parodying anything really, but he's constantly questioning. He's constantly alluding, he's playing with your expectations, he's getting you to look at things differently from different perspectives, and he's getting you to question everything you thought you knew. So I mean, that's there from the beginning.
And I think something interesting about the Metamorphoses in general is this sort of tension between bigness and smallness, in that it is an epic and it's sprawling, but it's composed of all these tiny units that, while they transform into one another, once they're in the past, they're gone. And there's this, the epyllion versus the epic, perhaps it's both at once, and the sense of writing this enormous poem, which is segmented into so many sort of atoms. And is this something Ovidian that we can talk about, that he works the smallness into the bigness without sacrificing that shape?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and this idea of the kind of the miniature epic, right? The little mythological story is the epyllion. That's what we call it now. It wasn't an ancient term, but it's like a little epic. This became really popular in the Hellenistic period. Catullus, he has his poem 64, which is an epyllion. Quite a few of the poets in the 1st century BCE were writing these things. And they did, I mean, the authors of these did see themselves as somewhat opposed to the epic tradition. This was a little epic, not a big epic. I mean, Callimachus is the poet, the Alexandrian poet of the 3rd century BCE, who this kind of goes back to. And he has this wonderful, quotable phrase, a big book is a big evil, mega biblion, mega kakon, right? So this kind of anti-epic sentiment. And so the Hellenistic poets and the Roman poets who were influenced by them, they wrote these shorter little versions of epic, often with a female perspective, right? Often kind of turning epic values on their head. Epic was gravis, was heavy, and epyllions were levis, light. Epic was juros, hard, and epillia were mollus, soft. But yeah, so here's Ovid, he comes along and he writes an entire epic poem. Not just an epic, but one that goes from the very beginning of time until his own day, right? So the scope of this epic poem is absolutely, it's everything, right? And so it has the largest scope of any epic ever, but then he builds that lightness, the softness, the brevity into that epic. So I mean, this I think is another feature of Ovid's poetry from the Heroides onward, is this generic hybridity, right? So he plays on the, in the Heroides he's wedding elegy with epistles, and in the Ars Amatoria he's wedding elegy with didactic poetry, and there in the Metamorphoses he's wedding epic with elegy in lots of ways. So I mean, this is a hallmark, I think, of Ovid throughout his career.
And something else interesting in the structure of the Metamorphoses is first approaching it, especially in our very post-Metamorphoses scope. It's almost like the tale of tales. It's a combination of all sort of ancient Greek myth and then sort of pushing it over in the Virgilian sense to Italy and tying a bow over it. But in fact, when you read it more closely, he's sort of meandering around the better known stories and finding the parts of them that haven't been emphasized. And then when you hit a very well-known story, it's done in 4 lines, and then he moves over. So it isn't really what it could have been, which is, this will bring everything together and explain it all and join it up. Rather, it has that vibe, especially beginning with the creation of the world, the universe. But instead of following it, it says, but what was happening in this bit here? What other thing was this character doing? Which I guess could be showing off how learned he was. I know all the details. I know all the lesser known stories, and I'm going to kind of speckle them in. But equally, it feeds into this idea maybe of the mock epic in doing the thing that isn't done, emphasizing the other thing. So you're turning the whole thing upside down, and that could also be all of these kind of intensely psychological female perspectives, particularly in the middle books.
Yeah.
So it's the history of mythology, but twisted. And I say post Metamorphoses for us because we're so inundated with specific work derived from this text that it's become almost normal. There are still a few that are surprising, like the Labyrinth and the Minotaur just being okay, and then that happened, moving on.
Right.
But I feel like maybe we don't quite see quite how left field a lot of this stuff is.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I like that, you say it's the epic about stories. It's an epic about storytelling. And I think what's so great about Ovid is that he's always showing that every person who's ever told a story has made choices about how they're going to tell that story. Who's the main character of the story? Who are we following through? Like you're saying, what Ovid is great at doing is he's always underscoring the idea that a story can be told in so many different ways. The Aeneid is the story of Aeneas, but there are a lot of characters in that story that we could center those events around. And so that's what Ovid is doing in the Heroides. And I think another thing that he does in the Metamorphoses that's so interesting is there's this sleight of hand, like you're saying, like the story of Dido. He does that in like 4 lines. He's not going to skirt. I mean, he's going to skirt around that material and focus on something new. But he also does this with substitutions. So instead of, say, telling us about Ariadne, which is a story that he loves. I mean, he talks about Ariadne and the Ars Amatoria and the Fausti, but he doesn't put it in the Metamorphoses. He instead gives us an alternate version in the story of Scylla, who is the daughter of Nisus and falls in love with Minos, and she betrays her father and tries to run off with Minos, and he rebuffs her. But so he's always like substituting out, right? He doesn't tell us the story of Medea killing her children, which is something that he also goes over very, very quickly.
But we get the rest of her life, yeah.
Exactly, everything else about Medea. Filling in those gaps, as you were saying. But he does tell us about Arachne, who murders her son Itys to get retaliation against Tereus for the rape of Philomela. So he offers these substitutions all the time. So I think that, he's always drawing attention to himself as a storyteller in that way, saying, I'm telling these other versions that you haven't seen before, or I'm telling the same story from a different point of view. And so that's why I really appreciate that. And of course, I think that that's what so many people are continuing to do with mythology by telling us the same story from different perspectives too. There's so many books out right now, novels. I can't keep up with how many mythological retellings there are.
Yeah.
And I've got a very broad question, perhaps unanswerable, but we can give it a go. But why is it that Roman culture tried to gerrymander Greece almost completely, just took their sort of written and oral culture and just said, no, that can be our thing, and spent such efforts integrating it into what they considered Roman culture? And in a way, the Metamorphoses is a history of this. How do we metamorphise from Greece to Rome? And we get it as the books go on. And the Aeneid is another example of a great poet saying, how do we get all that stuff over to our shore physically, literally, in a big journey? And I'm not sure if there's really a precedent for one culture absorbing so holistically another one. And then, almost every work of every poet, it's not original per se, but reworkings of the guys over in the East, what they were doing, and seeing how we can transform it without reinventing it completely into our own thing. And I wonder, sort of as a bonus question, what originality really means for the Latin poet, because of course you can't go that far away. Latin theatre is much like Menander and those Greek comedies, and then Latin poetry, Latin epic borrows from Greek epic, and what's going on here?
That is at the heart of Roman literature. Nietzsche has a wonderful and I think absolutely correct statement where he says to translate is to conquer. It was to the Romans. To the Romans, to translate was to conquer. I mean, the word translatio literally means a bringing across, right? So, I mean, let's think about the Roman triumph for a moment. One of the things that the Romans did in their triumphs was they brought back people, they brought back even trees from the lands that they conquered, and they paraded them through the streets of Rome. This is now ours, right? And so there is that sense of ownership, right? I think in that act of absorbing Greek culture, translating Greek culture into Rome. And I think it's an act of conquering to a degree, right? At the same time, you have the Roman political value of liberty, libertas. And so that's, I mean, I think the Romans give us this framework for thinking about translation, which I've been thinking about a lot, in that you have the faithful translator who's like servile, this is Horace, he kind of is responsible for this. You have the literal translator who's very subservient and servile and obsequious and doing the word for word thing. But then you have the free poet who's adapting and putting his own stamp on and, you know, contaminating in the case of those plays, right? You take a bit from this play, you take a bit from that play, you put it together, it's contaminatio. And that's all an exercise of independence, right? You replace that poet's, like if you're Catullus, you replace Sappho's name with your own in your translation of her poem. So I think so many Roman political ideals are getting worked out in how they're handling Greek literature. Ownership, conquering, they're thinking about freedom, they're thinking about servility. So it's a great lens, I think, into the Roman political mind. But of course, Horace also has that famous saying that Greece conquered its conqueror, right? And so so you have, of course, this kind of ambivalence, I think, often in the Roman mind towards Greek literature and what it's doing to Roman morality and things like that. So yeah, I mean, I think that the Romans were always very ambivalent, I guess is the word, about their relationship with Greek literature, their relationship with Greek art and culture more generally, and in translation and adaptation. All of that is really bound up with that ambivalence. I don't know if that answers your question at all, but that's
yeah. It's good. Do you feel that you conquered the Metamorphoses?
God, no. I completely and utterly reject thinking about translation in Roman political terms. I was saying this in a talk I gave just last week. Like, I think of this as like negotiation. I probably am more kind of the subservient translator, I think, in some ways, than a lot of people would like or themselves to be. So I mean, I think so much of this gets, translation is a space where this gets we have the idea of like the original poet who's going to take on the Romans and put their own stamp. They're going to take on the Greeks and put their own stamp. You know, sometimes I will read a translation, and I'm thinking, this isn't Catullus. This isn't Ovid. This is Mandelbaum.
Yeah, Mandelbaum especially has that reputation of being an English poet in his own right. Yeah, exactly.
And to me, and that's fine and that's great. But so much of what I love about the original kind of gets lost. And so what I think I've reformulated this in my own mind a bit to think about all of those constraints I give myself, so metrical constraints of trying to keep the original architecture intact, constraints of trying to replicate some of the poetic effects I see there rather than creating completely new ones. I think of those as my muse, right? So if there's anything that really fuels the production of anything poetic in my translations, it's that I'm being inspired by the original to kind of try to replicate some of things I see there. So I'm not always, when I approach this, I'm not thinking, I'm going to show Ovid what Stephanie McCarter can do to his poems or anything like that. I'm using him as my muse to create what I hope is something that people will enjoy reading. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just there's this notion of compensation in translation, and it's giving one thing over to the other. And I suppose the more radical translators might say, well, I'm compensating beauty for beauty. This is a thing that is wow, so I got to do that myself. And there's plenty of compensation in your translation. The most obvious being of meter, compensating the dactylic meter for the more familiar sort of iambic pentameter. But it's curious to hear that the dactyls are a little foreign even for Latin. And so Ovid was sort of, borrowing this Greek style with words that don't completely fit. And I've seen I've seen Latimore's translations of the Greek epics where he does go for that dactylic hexameter, which is a great effort. I'm not sure, again, how much English can be forced into that tube.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we get the point where you have to compensate something, but you can do so perhaps without sort of sacrificing the poet on the altar of your invention. And therefore be, I have replaced Ovid with a poem equally good in English as his is in Latin, rather than trying to get the Latin into English and give someone a sense of what it's like to read the Latin who can't or won't ever do so.
Right. And I think people should be reading more than one translation of the Metamorphoses. I think of all the things that I'm subjecting people to that are my own, right, when they read the translation. So it's my choice of meter. I like iambic pentameter. I think it works well for Ovid. I don't use iambic pentameter to translate Catullus's hexameters, but they work for Ovid's hexameters because they're so fast. But so it's my choice of meter. It's my taste in poetry. There's nothing I loathe more than Ovid being translated into like a Victorian mode. Like I can't bear it. I'm not a big Victorian poetry person. So you're being subjected to my poetic tastes, right? When you read my translation. I don't like flowery language in poetry, so you're not going to see a lot of that there. So I think people should read and sample and realize that, the translators are making so many choices for them. And some people may agree or disagree. So certainly that's the case too, if I can talk about Catullus for just a moment, where you have all this metrical variety. And I don't think that some of those meters work well in English. He is writing in hendecasyllables, and there are some good poems in English written in hendecasyllables. I'm thinking of I think it's Tennyson's hendecasyllabics. Oh, you chorus of indolent reviewers, but they just tend not to. So, I choose to do that in iambic pentameter. Or you have the coleams, which have a funny line ending. I give it a funny line beginning by doing headless iams. But it's all subjected to my own whims and tastes. So, I think that's... I don't think there's such a thing as a faithful translation. That's the thing. I don't think they exist. I think it's just a figment of people's imagination. You have I think translations that are what we call translationese, right? That torture the English syntax beyond belief. But even those, you don't have a single word that's the same. You're still being subjected to the translator's personality in some way, their training. So I don't know. I think that you're sacrificing everything in some ways to build something new. It's just that what I choose as my muse is Ovid, and rather than. I'm not. I didn't. I don't have an MFA in modern poetry or something like that. But I will say, when I was translating, I was reading a lot of modern poetry. Like I was staying away from Byron, for example. But I was reading a lot of like Evan Boland, because that was the kind of straightforward clarity I was really hoping to achieve. So.
And one controversial element in your translation which maybe shouldn't be controversial, but is the use of these chapter subheadings, which I think, they assist in that target of clarity. But why is that controversial? And why, in addition, did you decide, well, that's a good way to organize this mass of sort of transforming text?
Well, okay, I can talk about this for a moment. I could show you my manuscript I sent to Penguin, and those headings were in the same size font as the rest, and
Yes,
there
okay.
it was a continuous thing. So those subheadings were just they were just in bold, and every single translation that exists of Ovid, pretty much, except for maybe Mary Innes's, which is a prose translation, has subheadings. They're usually in bold, sometimes often in italics, just like mine were. It was Penguin who chose to make them bigger and to kind of separate them. I will say
Yeah.
that I kind of like it, and because I think that for the classroom it works well.
Yeah.
And I was talking with somebody from the Brooklyn Rail, and I think that was from the Brooklyn Rail, and he was saying that he had never noticed this bit where Pelops mourns for Niobe, which is such a wonderful moment in the epic, but he'd never noticed it before. But because they made my title really big and gave it its own page, that he read it and it kind of touched him. Well, the other thing I think is controversial is just that I use the word rape, and some people don't like that. So
Yeah, and especially the use of rape in combination with the chapter headings mean that you get some books where it's just X rapes Y, Z rapes A, B rapes, like every single chapter heading just includes the word rape.
yeah. There are also people being transformed and flayed in those chapter headings. I don't think anybody gets upset that I use the word flay.
It's true.
So,
Yeah.
I mean,
Could we go just back to style? I'm interested in this clear, concise style you went for. I think yours is the translation of the Metamorphoses, which has the lowest line count.
Probably not now,
No,
because
okay.
Luke Susi's translation, which came out a few months after mine, I think has the same number of lines as Ovid.
Sure, yeah, but it's significantly more compressed
Yeah.
than maybe what we're used to. The one I sort of imprinted on was the David Rayburn back in, like, I can't remember, I read it about 10 years ago, and loved it, but I had no access to Latin, so I'm just reading an English poem, and I can, depending on the culture of a translation, a culture around a translation, there can be a lot of different there's a lot of different things you're trying to compensate for that are already there in the culture. So when you're translating Ovid, you're used to translations being flowery, used to there being a bit of extra adjectives the way they weren't there before, things like that, just fleshing it out, the translators bringing themselves to that. When we were talking to Robert Alter, who translated the Hebrew Bible, he had sort of the opposite thing, where, these biblical translation committees, they're like, literalism is everything, partly because it's a holy book. It's very important that we say which specific kind of nard is being used, and we neglect some of the poetic effects. Do you have any examples of places where you went for clarity where previous translations went for a slightly more flowery rendering, like a few specific examples?
Can I give you some examples that may not completely answer your question exactly?
Sure.
Like you want me to? Okay, well, I want to give two examples. So, like, Mandelbaum versus myself. I mean, that you had mentioned Mandelbaum before, and we kind of had talked about him. So I'll read you some lines in Mandelbaum, and then I'll read you some lines from my own, if that's okay. And then I want to compare both of us with what Ovid is doing in this one passage. And I hope that this demonstrates, like, what I think of as Ovid being my muse. And why I'm trying, my trying to be concise was not me being like not putting my own stamp on the text. It was just, I had different objectives from Mandelbaum. So, okay. There's this description of the arrows of Cupid in book 1, just before he shoots Apollo and Daphne. And in the Latin, these are very much, as I said, Ovid has these line stops, right? So like one line has almost a complete sense. So if I were to translate this like literally, line by line to you, I would say like, he's Cupid, he spoke and he struck the air with his beaten wings. That's the whole line, okay? And then quickly he stood on the shady citadel of Parnassus. That's the next line. So these lines are being contained, right? And then from his arrow-bearing quiver, he took out 2 darts. That's a whole line. And then you have this enjambment right here of different tasks. So these 2 darts have 2 different tasks. One puts love to flight, one makes love. That's the second half of that line. And then you have these wonderful 2 lines that describe the darts. And I'm just going to read these in Latin, if that's okay. Can I read these 2 lines in Latin? Because they're patterned after one another. Up until the middle, the meter is perfectly identical. There's a rhyme in the meter. And then at that point, the meter takes off in 2 different directions in the 2 different lines. Okay. And so I think that this is illustrating what the darts do, right? What the arrows do. They look similar, they're shot similarly, but they have completely 2 different effects on the person who is shot, right? So the 2 lines in Latin are, so this is the golden arrow that is sharp and it creates love. So quod facit aura tumst et, sorry, I can't read this, et cuspide fulget acuta. Okay, so you have this aura tumst in the middle. And then the dull dart that makes love flee is quod fugat obtus umst. So you have that rhyme. Et habet sub harundine plumbum. If you're listening to that, you hear the rhyme, you followed the meter, it's identical. So when I translated this, I tried to do that too. So my translation, I'll just read the synymic pentameter. So he spoke and struck the air with beaten wings. That's its whole line. Then quickly stood on top of dark Parnassus. Its whole line. From his full quiver, he took out 2 arrows with different tasks. So you have the enjambment that I talked about there. One fends love off, one forms it. And then here's the 2 lines with the rhyme in the middle. The last is gold, its head pointed and flashing. The first is dull with lead atop its shaft. And so the meter is identical, you have the rhyme, and then the meter goes off in 2 directions after that. So I tried to use Ovid as kind of my inspiration for what I was doing because I liked the effect that it created. But when you look at Mandelbaum, his lines are flowing into each other. And instead of 8 lines like Ovid and I have, he's got 10, right? So I'll read you Mandelbaum a bit. So that said, he hurried off. He beat his wings until he reached Parnassus' shady peak. There from his quiver Cupid drew 2 shafts of opposite effect. The first rejects, the second kindles love. These lines are flowing into one another. Let's see. The last is golden. That's the end of its line. Its tip is sharp and glittering. The first, there's another line in, is blunt. Its tip is leaden. And with this blunt shaft, the god pierced Daphne. They're just, his architecture is completely different. And it's not that I don't like Mandelbaum as a poem, I really do. It's just I think about the architecture of the poems that I'm translating all the time. And I just think often with Mandelbaum, he's going for very different architecture. And I'm thinking about the shape of the lines that Ovid is creating a lot. Whereas I think maybe Mandelbaum is giving himself a lot more free rein in that regard. So maybe mine isn't as flowery as Mandelbaum's there. I'm not sure, but it's because I had different kind of priorities that had to do with meter and the shape of the line, if that makes sense.
You're also using like kind of more Germanic vocabulary, and Mandelbaum's always picking the Latinate kind of polysyllables where possible.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, that's true. I think that's a really good point. Now, I think there will be less of that in my Catullus translation because I give myself a longer line for his hexameters, but I also go line for line. But then I also, like, just as a second way of approaching the question, I kind of got tickled because I read something on the internet about how somebody thought Frank Justice Miller's translation was more poetic than mine. And I think I laughed for about 10 minutes because his translation is in prose and very clearly in prose. And so I'm thinking about, the expectations we have for poetry to be flowery. And again, I'm just not drawn to flowery poetry. But so I thought I would read like a little bit from Frank Justice Miller's prose translation to think through what I think they meant. So this is from Apollo and Daphne as well. And this is the very end where Daphne has been transformed into a tree. And Apollo is almost singing a hymn to her. And one of the things you do in ancient hymns is you use the word you a lot. Okay, you who. If you think of like the Our Father, so Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, right? And that's there in the Greek. So anyway, I'll read you Frank Justice Miller's. So Apollo says, "Since thou canst not be my bride, thou shalt at least be my tree." I mean, you can hear already, it's the archaism, right? That might feel more like poetry. I mean, maybe you feel like one might feel like one is reading Shakespeare there or something along those lines. But he goes, "My hair, my lyre, my quiver shall always be entwined with thee, O laurel." So he gets the these and the thous in there. This is from 1916. I am not going to write a translation that has thee and thou or canst, things like that. So I think I got the yous in there. I just didn't do it in archaic language. So in my translation, "But since he said, you cannot be my wife, you'll be my tree. You will adorn my hair, laurel, and you my lyre, and you my quiver." So the effect is there. It's just, I'm trying to do it in more contemporary, maybe Germanic monosyllabic language.
But I think it's an interesting idea, this sense of archaism in translation and in poetry. And when the King James version was compiled of older Bibles, they chose not to modernize it according to, Jacobean standards because they thought it had this interesting ancient texture. And I suppose when translating more recent literature, say, Victorian era German literature, there could be this temptation to, well, if it is slightly older German language, maybe we render it in English with something that feels to the English reader like it's a Dickens era book. Equally, that I think the tendency in translations is not to do that and to render it in the current mind of the translator, which naturally speaks the modern language. And I'm not sure if one could even match that effect. Like, is Ovid writing in a very new, fresh mode? Or does he shift into these older, archaic forms? And is that worth mirroring in English? Is it worth bringing out the weird old poltroon, for instance, if he's chosen a weird language? Or is it better if the current mind doesn't recognize poltroon at all to ignore it completely? And it's the strange effect, like when Chaucer is translated into another language from the Middle English, an English person often really struggles to read original Chaucer because it's a different language and you sort of have to squint and, wow, that word doesn't mean that anymore. However, the German reading Chaucer in German, it's easy peasy, just next page, okay, that makes a lot of sense. And I wonder if there's any point where the translator ought to try and make something feel older than it is, especially when we're talking Latin. I mean, that's something, we have no English equivalent. We can't go back to Latin era English because it didn't exist. Right, so exactly. should it just feel new? Should we feel like the Roman reading of it relative to his time, or should we feel like the modern man reading ancient literature, which I think the latter more in his Greek translations, because they're so bizarre because of these long lines, gives you this feeling of antiquity. It makes you feel like, wow, this is not English poetry. I'm diving into something else. But I wonder, what do you feel about this whole tension?
I don't know if it's necessarily a question of what we should do, but what the translator chooses to do. Again, it's the subjectivity of the translator, right? That's where the art of translation resides. And And so there do exist archaizing translations of the Metamorphoses. I mean, if somebody wants that, they can read A.D. Melville. That exists, right? And if they want the longer flowing, non-in-stopped lines, they can pick up Melville, right? The reader can make their poetic tastes align with the translator. And so some people won't necessarily want to read, I mean, maybe they don't want to read a translation where there are blunt terms like slay and rape. They want to read flowery translations where there are terms like, ravish. So that's fine. Go read. I mean, so I don't know if it's what we should do, but I think that a variety of translations being out there makes it nice for the person who wants to have the experience of reading something old. They can go and do that. Now, I do think there are times when it's appropriate for the translator to maybe archaize a bit, but I don't know if that's okay with Ovid, because he's not archaic. I mean, we have archaic Latin poetry. We have, lots of fragments from Ennius. Lucretius has tons of archaisms in his epic. And they're not, and they are archaisms already at the time that Lucretius is writing. He knows he's writing in archaisms. So that would be nice, I think, to use some archaic language there. But for Ovid, I mean, it's creating, I think, an effect that, to my mind, just isn't there in the Latin, only to try to make it feel old. Now, there are plenty of fancy poetic words in Ovid. I mean, you get lots of compound words that it's hard to do in English in the same way. You get of course, I think for verbal play, Ovid is more interested in kind of like puns, things like that. Whereas with, say, Catullus, you get invented words a lot more than, say, with Ovid. So trying to keep some of that. I mean, I can give you an example from both of them if you like. So in book, I can't remember what book it is. There's this passage. It's in the Little Aeneid section of the Metamorphoses, and he's describing how people are transformed into apes, but he doesn't tell you what they turn into. But he has a pun telling you. So he says, and I actually probably have this written down because I printed out some of my notes. So in terms of wordplay, yes. So he says here that they are dissimiles homini, unlike a human being, and they are similes, like a human being at the same time. But the dissimiles and similes it's punning on the Latin word for ape, which is simia. And so he's telling you that they turned into apes through the pun. And so as a translator, I thought, well, I'll get that. Their looks aped humans, but did not ape humans, because we have this idea of aping as imitating. So that's a very characteristically Ovidian thing to do, right? Whereas Catullus, he just like invents words. I don't know how PG you want me to be. Do you want me to be PG or can I be R?
We can go Catullus. We can go R. Yeah.
Go R. Okay. So, I mean, he has this word that he makes. This is a much more Catullus thing to do. He writes this poem to this woman called Ipsatilla, and he asks her to invite him over for 9 back-to-back fututiones. And the word fututio is from the Latin futuere, which means to fuck. But it is a word that he makes up to indicate like this big exaggerated amount, right? Well, then how do you do that in English, right? Helen Morales was reviewing Daisy Dunn's translation of Catullus in the Times Literary Supplement several years ago, like a decade ago now. And she was displeased with the fact that Daisy Dunn just translated it as fucks rather than trying to get any kind of wordplay in there.
Fuckathon.
So all these,
Fuck that
all these people, yeah, exactly. That's what Peter Green did. So all these people wrote into the Times Literary Supplement and started what the TLS titled The Great Fututiones Debate, right? I went with the word fuckathon, but at any rate, that's the challenge, and then that's the difference. So all of it, it's kind of puns. Catullus, it's much more inventiveness in like making up words as opposed to wordplay, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think when we're touching on how the people of the time would have interpreted and read these poets and the way that they use language. I think also that sort of controversy we mentioned earlier of you using just very bluntly the word rape when
Yeah.
this particular Latin word or phrase comes up. And I wonder about the response of people, because I think you mentioned in your introduction that rape was still considered this very severe, very serious thing. It wasn't necessarily playful at the time. We're not
Right.
looking at a culture where it's, whatever.
Absolutely.
So that, keeping that in mind, how did people feel about an epic which is almost like this enormous interlinked series of rapes, which are just stated very bluntly? Was that, in the way that it is to the modern view, a little bit horrifying, when you're going through, and there's much in it that's very entertaining, but you're sort of in the shadow of the constant death and rape and conquest going through the entire thing. Was this something that the Roman reader would also have seen and been somewhat mortified by?
100% completely mortified by. I mean, if you think of the Roman foundation myth, right, for the Republic, it was the rape of Lucretia. Not only would they have been mortified by it, they wrote a myth explaining how they overthrew the monarchy because of it, right? I mean, in the way that Ovid writes a lot of these rapes, he makes it very clear these are, I mean, there are not a lot of enslaved people in the world of the Metamorphoses. You might have noticed, like if you're reading the Odyssey, there are tons of enslaved people. If you read the Ars Amatoria by Ovid, the presence of slaves is everywhere.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
But in the Metamorphoses, it's not. And a lot of the, I think he's writing these victims of sexual violence very clearly to be elite, free women who were marriageable, right? Who could have passed citizenship status on to their children if they were Roman women, right? So he really wants the reader to understand this, and he uses the clearest language possible in a lot of these scenes. It's legal. I mean, the Latin word is vis, and he often combines this with the phrase posse est. So vim posse est means she experienced violence, but patio can also mean like to be sexually penetrated. So I mean, it means like to be sexually penetrated through an act of violence, right? Another, Ovid uses the word stuprum, which is again a legal term. It's illicit sex, and he pretty much uses it exclusively for rape. So I mean, to use a word like ravish does not get the clear-cut legal term across. But of course, and so I wanted it to be as clear as possible. I use the word rape because that is our legal term. Ovid is using legal terms. I often use the word force, however, quite a bit. I mean, I actually use the word force for vis more often than I use the word rape because I think that there's force that operates throughout the epic in lots of different ways. So Medea talks about the force of love, right? Love is exerting a kind of violence. Vis is the thing that, it's like the power to transform somebody. Love transforms us. Sexual violence transforms us. And then the power of the gods can transform us. So all of these things are kind of part of this same tapestry of power, right, that runs throughout the epic. Now, how do people respond to it as being an epic that has so much sexual violence in it? And there's a big debate about that, right? I mean, so you have, on the one hand, might be someone like Sharon James who thinks that Ovid is very sympathetic, right, towards the victims of violence. On the other hand, you have, Amy Richland, who thinks that it's very voyeuristic, it's almost pornographic in the way that he presents the violence. My take on it is that I think pretty much everything written in the Augustan period has to be read somewhat politically. And so I think that Ovid is using sexual violence and the plight of these female characters to think about the loss of liberty under the emperor. Because what liberty really was to the Roman mind was bodily autonomy. It was being able to do with your body what you wanted to do with your body, but even more than that, it was about not being subjected to another person's arbitrary violence. And this was a kind of bodily autonomy that non-enslaved free women who could who were marriageable could have expected to have as well. Now, of course, enslaved women would not have had this kind of bodily autonomy. A lot of women who would have been considered infamous, so disreputable, wouldn't have had this kind of bodily autonomy. But I think, Ovid is thinking a lot about what it means to no longer have, if you're a free Roman, that kind of agency over your own body anymore, right? And so to me, it's a really profound way of thinking through a big political question in the epic through these repeated stories of sexual violence.
It's worth saying that the poet, the kind of artist that Ovid compares himself to in the opening in the poem is a weaver. We get a weaver in the Metamorphoses. We get the story of Arachne, who is so good at weaving that it makes Minerva jealous. They have a weaving contest, and we get descriptions of the two tapestries that they make. Minerva's is one that shows the gods in their splendor, and Arachne's tapestry shows the gods doing what they actually did, showing the gods in their more compromised state, and actually recalling lots of the stories that are in the Metamorphoses already. There's definitely a certain sympathy between the poet Ovid and Arachne there, that they're both showing those in power in their compromised state as not only fallible but the actual force bringing evil into the world. Arachne is punished after making this tapestry by being turned into a spider, and as a spider she can still be a weaver. She can still make beautiful patterns. A spider web is very beautiful, but it's abstract. It's no longer about what it was formerly about. It no longer has this subversive effect that it previously had, and I wonder whether there's this, some of the Arachne story is actually in Ovid himself, where there's this, he famously exiled from Rome for some sort of poem and a mistake, and then is forced into a sort of slightly more abstract mode, making spider webs that don't necessarily communicate directly political feelings in the way that might have been possible before. Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, yes, I think that Ovid is Arachne in so many ways, but he's also Minerva too. I mean, what Minerva's tapestry communicates is don't screw with the gods or we will transform you, right? I mean, the epic communicates that power of the gods again and again. I mean, and I guess, in his own life, Ovid learned that lesson because he came into into the wrath of Augustus, and he learned that Augustus, has the power to arbitrarily move his body, right? So he ended up in Thomas. I don't know. I mean, I think that, the exile poetry is so interesting. I don't know if I would ever compare that to Arachne's, the spider webs that she weaves after she's transformed. Because, I mean, what Ovid is so good at, it's the constant sleight of hand he's always doing. He's so slippery. You feel like he could, argue his way out of anything. And so, he... Also, what my favorite thing is, and the way I think he still exercises his defiance in the exile poetry, he still manages it, is when in a later poem he is... I think it's Tristia too, but I could be wrong. But he's saying, I wrote this wonderful epic that surely you liked that, Augustus. It was from the beginning of the world to your own time, right? And so he's flattering Augustus here. But anybody even at all familiar with the opening of the Metamorphoses knows that he did not write a poem that went from the world's beginning to Augustus's time. He wrote a poem that goes from the beginning of the world to mea tempora, to my own time, is what Ovid says. He puts himself as the telos of all time and creation, right? Yeah. So by rewriting that moment in flattery of Augustus, what he's really doing is he's reminding you of what he did in the first place, right?
Yeah.
And that moment, that original moment, is what gets underlined and gets. I mean, then we really see the defiance of that, as opposed to the kind of flattery that he's offering later. So I think he still finds so many cool ways to be as defiant as ever in the exile poetry.
Yeah.
And
Maybe if
he ends the poem, well, he ends the poem with his own deification, more or less. And it would be a really awkward epilogue if it wasn't completely true. You know, you're reading it, shaking your head. Don't say you're immortal for all the centuries to come. But there's me
Right.
reading it in a post-Roman territory, remembering his name. Fine, you're right. You got it right.
Right, exactly. Yeah. He didn't turn into Ozymandias there, right?
yeah,
He
yeah.
was no, that I mean that's wonderful. I mean the final metamorphosis in the poem is his own, right? Yeah, and I'm
Into
glad
his
that
books, himself into his book.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he kind of, he. It sounds so bold. Like my students, like, oh, how can he have? Well, there's this great Australian phrase that we don't have in America that we really need to adopt. I don't know if it's elsewhere in the world, but he has tickets on himself. Is this a phrase you all have ever
It's not
heard?
one I've.
No Australian likes to have tickets on themselves because this is the land of the tall poppy gets cut down. But at any rate, certainly the Romans did not mind having tickets on themselves. But Ovid is imitating Horace as well. I mean, in the end of Epistles 120, which is Horace's kind of envoy to his poems, he kind of transforms into his own book of poetry. But what's interesting there is that whereas Ovid becomes a god, Horace's book becomes a prostitute. It's trying to sell itself in the bookshops. So I think that difference is kind of key and
Yeah.
funny.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the progression of nature itself in the Metamorphoses, you start with this nature that's sort of clay, dead stuff, chaos, and it needs to be sculpted. The metaphor used for nature is sculpture, sculpted by a god, by an unnamed god, and but then by the time we get to the end, to the Pythagoras speech especially, we get a picture of a nature that's kind of self-sculpting, self-creating, a nature as an artist. So what was once, the dead clay has become an artist itself. And it's very interesting actually reading the Metamorphoses in the current world and then just going on a walk in a park. You do look at trees a bit funny. And yeah, I wonder if while you were reading it, whether a bit of this sort of Roman cosmology, this Roman way of looking at nature, started creeping in slightly, because it really does with me every time I reread it as a reader. You start thinking about the world as something much more conscious. Um,
Yeah, yeah. I think that's something we need to do in a way. I mean, the Romans, one of the, I mean, they imbued almost everything with a kind of divinity. Or I mean, nature was, I mean, you had, trees had their own little divine power, right? Nature was numinous, right? And but I will say, but I will say that I can't, I couldn't. I got to the point where I couldn't walk through the woods without, like you say, seeing a tree. There's this wonderful tree in Sewanee, where I live in the U.S., that looks pregnant. I mean, she really just looks like a pregnant tree. And every time I walk past it, I see Mira, right? And I think, and so I'm reminded of Mira, but I'm also aware of how these myths probably came to be in the first place, right? Somebody back in the day was walking past a tree that might have looked pregnant, and that experience connects us over time, right? But I also I needed to get away from Ovid's view of nature as well when I was translating. So actually, when I was working on the Metamorphoses, I was also living in Australia then, and where we were living at the time, we had this little wetland down from our house, and I would go out at the end of every day. I would walk down there, and there were often little welcome sparrows, which are the most common kind of welcome swallows, which are the most common kind of swallow in Australia. And every time I looked at them, I was reminded of Arachne, because she turns into a swallow. But in the Australian version, these are welcome swallows. They're harbinger of good things. They're harbingers of land and harbor and safety, right? And so it was nice to realize that the world can be numinous and it can be filled with kind of power and connect us across time. And at the same time, it's not the violent world that Ovid is describing often. It was nice to be reminded that the swallow does not have its origin in child murder and rape. Right.
Recently, I've been watching Life on Earth, that first sort of staggering David Attenborough 1979 documentary, and being blown away by its ambition. The first episode begins with kind of pre-amoeba, and it gets all the way to coral. So you've got an hour of television and you haven't got to a kind of moving, face-bearing being. But having recently read the Metamorphoses, it feels like if Ovid had been around when evolution was proposed, he would have been fairly on board. And so much of the poem, while it has its very human psychological inspirations, is also explaining natural phenomena. It's explaining, why are things like this? Where do swans come from? Why does this tree look pregnant? How about this particular kind of flower? Why does it have this AI shape written on it? And it's a way of conceptualizing the universe and explaining how everything got where it got. If we began with this sort of unformed matter, which is more or less where the David Attenborough show begins, how did it become so varied, so infinite and beautiful, and apparently containing meaning? And the way it happens is that things have to be, the gods are transforming beings with thoughts and feelings into objects. And it happens that way far more than the other. There are some teeth that become men, and a few other examples of the inanimate becoming animate. But it's generally in the contrary direction. And I wonder also, we have this idea of flux, which Pythagoras delivers, but it's not really a Pythagorean idea, that you get several of the sort of pre-Socratic Greek philosophers who are really into this notion. And I wonder, in the Roman Augustan period, was this something that had much sort of scientific credibility? Did people believe in this constantly fluctuating universe, which sort of has a version of evolution built in, even if it's sort of between some kind of pantheism and natural science? Or was it in Ovid's entirely poetic? We don't believe any of this. It's just a way of thinking about the world.
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I mean, I guess I would say that the wedding of natural philosophy and poetry, as you point out, I mean, it goes back to the Pythagorean, or to the pre-Socratics, right? So that, I mean, it's there from the very beginning of the tradition. And poetry is the way that you work out the world. And then, of course, you had some reactions against that. So Epicurus was very hostile to writing poetry for the sake of Epicurean education and so on. But I think in the Roman, in the Romans themselves often continued to use poetry as a way of thinking about, natural philosophy. I mean, I'm thinking, of course, of Lucretius, right? I mean, I think so much of what Ovid is doing is actually a poetic response to Lucretius, who, writes about how atoms falling constantly through a void combine to create our world and everything in it, right? And whereas Ovid is kind of adding divinity back in. And so
mind.
In some ways,
it's a minded cosmos in Ovid.
It's a minded cosmos. But then, of course, that goes to the Stoics as well. I mean, the Stoics, everything was the fiery logos that animated the entire world. I mean, I don't think Ovid is ever really an Epicurean or a Stoic in terms of where he falls. But he is really heavily invested in the idea of poetry to explain the natural world. I guess too, with Ovid, I never get really sense of belief in Ovid. Like, I know Ovid as a poet. I don't know Ovid as a human being, if that makes sense. I was thinking about this before. I mean, he has all these different poetic faces that he wears, these personae in his poetry. He has these tendencies across all of his poems, but I don't get a sense that I know Ovid. I mean, there's a part of me like when I fell in love with Horace, it was because I felt like I knew Horace, but
Yeah.
I never feel like with Ovid. I mean, I'm always so hyper aware that in the Metamorphoses, this is a narrative persona. In the Ars Amatoria, this is a didactic persona. In the Amores, this is an elegiac, erotic persona. But it's always really hard to get a kind of view behind Ovid's mask. And even in the exile poetry, I don't know how much, a real fully formed human being ever appears that I can say has certain beliefs that come out in his verse.
And yeah, it's a great example of what Keats called a negative capability. He is everywhere and nowhere. There's this remarkable kind of androgyny that you mentioned in terms of the center of his attention. You get the lust portrayed of the raping or rapist gods, and then you also get the horror and fear of the victims. You get a total spread of interest, of awareness, of attention. Yeah, I wonder if this is one of the things, because this is one of the things that inspired Shakespeare. Ovid famously Shakespeare's most kind of most beloved classical analog, and people often point to the various stories from Ovid, from the Metamorphoses there are in Shakespeare, but there's also something of this Shakespearean sense of disappearing into the text, of it being kind of unclear, even in a play like Hamlet, where it's mostly just one character talking the entire time, unclear where exactly the writer exists in relation to these words or these various positions being brought in. And as you were saying as well, bringing in contemporary natural philosophy, contemporary politics, and it's in there, but you can't really say on which side Shakespeare or Ovid falls down. It certainly feels very like Shakespeare remains in my head always when I'm reading English translations of Ovid. Certainly in yours in blank verse, it's certainly a strange echo, a strange example of this Borgesian idea that influences you sort of retroactively end up creating your influences for the next generation of readers. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I just take it back to Shakespeare. I mean, there's a really good demonstration, I think, in Shakespeare of just how slippery Ovid is. And that's the Pyramus and Thisbe story, right? I mean, I don't know, how are we supposed to read that story? I mean, and, I think it too is Ovid as a storyteller. He's so hard to pin down. Is he on Arachne's side or is he on Minerva's side? Well, Pyramus and Thisbe, Shakespeare demonstrates beautifully how you can read it two different ways. It's a comedy in Midsummer Night's Dream, and it's a tragedy in Romeo and Juliet, right? So, I mean, I think he's a really good reader of Ovid in that way, and showing how you can't pin him down ever, really. And he's always we can read his stories in two different ways always, and he's always going to show us that every story has all these different possibilities.
It's rabid speculation, but why do you think there is this attention to women in Ovid? Is he just spending more time with women than contemporary poets? Horace seems like a man living in a man's world.
Yeah,
but I wonder what it is. I wonder where this attention and this interest in female subjectivity comes from.
Well, I mean, he certainly isn't inventing it in the Roman tradition, or I mean, it's Catullus, for example, is writing about women, and a lot of people have compared his Ariadne in poem 64, where he delivers this long soliloquy as Ariadne. That's a female persona that he's wearing at that moment, and he compares himself to a flower that Lesbia has plowed over, and this imagery of plowing is very sexual, and so it's putting him into the female role. So I think that there was this poetic tradition for male poets to examine female perspectives. I mean, if you go back to Greek tragedy, of course, too. I mean, you have Euripides. I mean, Euripides is constantly thinking about how the Trojan War affects women. So in some ways, I think this is part of the tradition that Ovid is inheriting. I wish that I could say that shows something about Ovid's psychology. I mean, he did choose to take up those stories from those particular predecessors. I mean, he chose to be influenced by Euripidean tragedy, for example, and I also think some of it too is, he had the Aeneid and he had to respond to the Aeneid in some way. I mean, he can't just rewrite what Virgil did. I mean, he's got to, he can't just write another epic about masculine pietas, right? About masculine dutifulness. He has to do something different. So you think about what pietas means for a woman. I will say that in his autobiographical poem, which is Tristia 410, I think it's 410. He tells us about his different familial relationships, and he mentions his father and his brother, but his other relationships were mainly with women. So if I could allow myself a little bit of biographical speculation about Ovid, he was married 3 times. First to a woman he says was like unworthy and not advantageous. Another woman he wasn't married to for very long. He doesn't tell us why, but he had this third wife who he was married to for decades. He doesn't give her a name, of course, but he was married. I mean, that's the thing that's so wild about Ovid is he writes, all of these naughty kind of, the Ars Amatoria is about being how to be a serial seducer. But
picking up chicks.
Picking up
Streets
chicks,
of
but
Rome.
but he's at home with his wife, and he has a daughter who's twice married, and he's a grandfather. So, I mean, he has these lots of... I mean, his life that as he describes it is one that's very much ensconced in the domestic, right, as opposed to politics. So the way he describes his life, at any rate, he was training for a political career. He didn't want to do that, so he turned to poetry. And so, I mean, at least in the persona that he's giving us in the exile poetry, he's taking all these tendencies we see towards, orientations towards the domestic, the feminine, and kind of characterizing his own life in a very similar way as well.
I wonder, just to round us off, whether you could talk about like the first time you encountered the Metamorphoses. When I first read it like 10 years ago, I was immediately fell in love with it. It's probably one of my desert island books, if not necessarily the one. I find it completely inexhaustible. It's new every time I read it. I just wonder whether, like, what your first experience with the Metamorphoses was. What was the first sort of, feeling, readily experience?
I want to respond to one thing, though, that you said that as a translator, I have to respond to. It's different every time I read it, too. And that's what's so frustrating about having translated it, because I had to do the one thing, and now it's published. And, I look at it now, and I'm like, I could do that completely differently. I wish I had done this instead. I mean, I see this now, and I didn't see it then. So,
second edition?
Maybe. Emily Wilson is redoing the Odyssey.
Yeah, I know, right? Well, she's coming on the show in 2 weeks. This was true at the time of recording, but since then, Emily Wilson cancelled the interview, and we haven't been able to reschedule with her. She may be on the show in future, but not in the near future. In 2 weeks.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah. Oh, wonderful. Well, you need to ask her. I mean, that's the thing about reading is such a dynamic thing, and a translator has to chisel things into stone, and that really sucks. But, I could translate the Metamorphoses forever, for all time. But I will say that my first experience with the Metamorphoses in English translation was with Mary Ennis's prose translation, and I'm becoming a bit obsessed with it. I'm becoming a bit obsessed with her, honestly. I'm working on a research paper on her.
Who is she? Could you just?
She was a Scottish woman. She was educated at Oxford, but I've got her. I've gotten all of these old school records of her, all kinds of things. But she taught at a couple universities in the UK, and during this period, she translated the Metamorphoses into prose for Penguin Classics UK. Which was when E.V. Rue was I don't know if I'm saying his name correctly, but he was the editor, and his policy was you translate into prose. I mean, he did not believe that these epics could be reproduced into English poetry, and he wanted to give them much more novelistic feeling, and he thought that that would make them more appealing to a kind of mass reading audience. So she was very much conforming to the expectations of Penguin Classics at that time. And her book is, I mean, it's still in print. It's very popular. People are buying Mary Ennis's prose translation all the time. You talked about your desert island.
Ali Smith or someone?
Ali Smith said that, exactly.
Yeah, said she'd picked
yeah,
that specific translation. Yeah.
She did indeed, yes. And but at any rate, no. But when you read the reviews of Mary Ennis's prose translation, I mean, they were just brutal. And I think one reason was that it came out at the same time as you had the oh gosh, why is my mind is A.E. Watts and the Rolfe Humphreys were all in the mid-50s, right around that same time. And so you had these male poets writing iambic pentameter translations. And so I found a review from the Sewanee Review, which is my home institution, and it was just like page after page after page of weighing the literary merits, and then it was like one little sentence, like, and if you like your epic and prose, you can read Mary Ennis. But actually, I'm glad now that hers was the first Metamorphoses I read, because I had never read a poetic version of Ovid's Metamorphoses until I got to the Latin. So I didn't have any other kind of poetic version of this kicking around in my head. And so I first really, really, really read the Metamorphoses as a graduate student in Latin. I had Sarah Myers at the University of Virginia and John Miller. They were both Ovid specialists, but I took a seminar with Sarah Myers. We read pretty much, most of it in Latin, I would think, and that was my first real encounter. Was as a graduate student. I came to Ovid a little bit later. I was pretty much a Horace person and a Virgil person, and then in graduate school wrote my dissertation on Horace, and I never considered translating Ovid until I was teaching him to particularly young women students in my, I teach lots of courses in women and gender in the ancient world. And one of the things I would do was, the first time I taught the Leucothoe story, I did a shitty job. I will just own up to that. The Leucothoe is in book 4, and she's very clearly, when you look at the Latin, she is raped. But my students couldn't quite figure out what was going on, and I couldn't quite figure out what was going on. It was Humphreys' translation we were reading, and I went back to my office and looked at it in Latin. I thought, oh God, this has been all obfuscated and euphemized. And then, whenever I would teach that story, I would always bring in the Latin and explain it to students. And so it was kind of that concern with sexual violence, coupled with the fact that I was already working on a translation of Horace, that kind of coalesced and brought me to the project. If that makes sense. I don't know what your question was, or if I answered it. Oh yeah, the first time, my first encounter with Ovid. Yes, there we go.
Okay, wonderful. We'll let you go, Stephanie. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for making time.
Of course.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.